The man who would change everything walked into the restaurant looking like he had walked there from the edge of the world. And the only person who smiled at him was the waitress nobody listened to. It was a Tuesday in late May, the slow hour before the dinner rush, and Nora Bell was refilling the salt cellars at the service stand when the front door of the Larkspur breathed open and let in a stranger and a gust of warm rain. She knew, the way you know weather, that he did not belong to the kind of evening the Larkspur sold. The Larkspur sold pressed linen and low gold light and the hush of people who had never once worried about the bill. This man wore a faded canvas jacket, gone pale at the shoulders, boots laced with the patient care of someone who had relaced them many times, and a battered pack riding high on his back, the kind a backpacker carries across long country, its straps darkened with sweat and salt. He had a week of road on his jaw, and the slow, careful gait of a person whose feet had been telling him things for a long time. Camille saw him first from the host stand and arranged her face into the polite regret she kept for people like him. "I'm sorry," Camille said, in the voice that was sorry about nothing. "We're fully committed this evening." Nora looked up. The dining room behind Camille held perhaps 9 tables, 4 of them empty, the candles not yet lit. Fully committed was a phrase Gideon had taught them all to use, the way you teach a dog to sit. It meant, "We do not want your kind in the window." The backpacker did not argue. He looked past Camille into the long glass room with an expression Nora could not place. Not hunger, exactly, though he was clearly hungry, and not hurt, though there was something close to it. He looked the way a person looks at a house they used to live in. Then he nodded. The small, courteous nod of a man who has been refused before and learned not to make a scene about it. And he turned to go. That was the moment Nora's whole life pivoted on, though she would not understand it for 9 days. "We've got the bar," she said. Camille's chin came around. "Nora." "The bar's first come," Nora said, already moving, the way she always moved, toward a problem instead of away from it. Because doing was easier than feeling, and she had learned that early. "He can sit at the bar. That's the rule. You wrote it on the laminated card yourself." The backpacker had stopped with one hand on the door. Up close, his eyes were a tired, attentive brown, and they moved over her apron, her pen behind her ear, the salt on her hands, and then to her face, and stayed there a beat too long, as though he were reading something he had not expected to find in this building. "I don't want to be trouble," he said. His voice was low and even and oddly precise, a careful voice, a voice that chose its few words and then stood behind them. "And I should tell you, I can't really pay restaurant prices tonight." "Then it's lucky," Nora said, "that the water's free, and I make the mistakes around here." A corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the memory of where a smile used to be. He let go of the door. She put him at the end of the bar, the warped end by the kitchen pass where the draft came through and the regulars never sat, and she filled a glass with cold water and set it down with the particular gentleness she used for people the room had already decided about. Behind her, she could feel Camille's disapproval, like a change in the temperature, and somewhere past the kitchen doors, Gideon Pratt's laugh climbed over the clatter of prep, smooth and rehearsed. The laugh of a man practicing for an audience that mattered more than this one. "You walked far," Nora said. It wasn't a question. "Far enough." He turned the water glass a quarter turn, then another, watching the light bend in it. "What's good?" She almost said the tasting menu, the 17 courses, the things she was supposed to say. Instead, she leaned a hip against the bar and looked at the hollow under his cheekbones and made a decision that had nothing to do with the laminated card. "Honestly, nothing you can afford, and nothing worth it anyway, the way it's cooked now." She said it quietly, glancing toward the pass. "But the staff eats at 5. There's a pot of white beans and greens back there with a ham hock that's been going since this morning, and bread Walt pulled an hour ago, and it's the best thing in this building by a mile, and it isn't on any menu. I can bring you that. We call it the house special that isn't a special." something shifted in his face. Surprise, and under the surprise, a kind of careful caution, as if she had said a password he'd half forgotten. "Why would you do that?" "Because you walked far," she said again. "And because the only thing worse than this place's prices is letting a hungry person watch other people eat. Sit. Don't make it weird." She brought in the beans in a chipped white bowl that should have been retired years ago, and the heel of Walt's bread, and a second bowl when the first was gone, before she'd finished wiping down the well. He ate the way hungry people who have manners eat. Slowly, on purpose, refusing to be an animal about it. And between the first bowl and the second, he closed his eyes for exactly one breath over the steam, and Nora pretended not to see. Because some things a person should be allowed to do alone. This is the part of the story she could never explain to anyone afterward. That she did not know who he was, and that this was the truest kindness she would ever give him, precisely because she did not know. His name, the one he gave her that night, was Daniel. He did not give a last name, and she did not ask, because the kind of people who came to the Larkspur gave last names the way other people gave gifts, expecting something back. And she had liked, for once, talking to someone who didn't. What Daniel did not tell her, what he had decided somewhere on the long road home, that he would not tell anyone in this building until he understood what it had become, was that the deed to the restored Victorian glasshouse around them, the soaring iron and glass conservatory with the climbing vines along its spine, and the heirloom larkspur gone half to ruin by the kitchen door, was in his name. That the company, whose people had just turned him away at his own front door, was his. That the laminated card with the rule about the bar had been printed under a logo he had spent 15 years building from a dish pit in this exact room. That the lonely, careful, road-worn man eating staff beans from a chipped bowl at the bad end of the bar was, by every measure the world used, a billionaire, and that he had come home in a backpacker's boots specifically so that no one would treat him like one. He had not expected to be thrown out. He had not, in his most cynical hour on the trail, expected the place Sal built to refuse a tired man a chair. What had he built, if a tired man could be turned away at the door of it in the rain? And he had not, in any hour at all, expected the waitress. Nora went back to her salt cellars. The dinner rush came in on its little tide of perfume and entitlement, and she was busy after that. And when she looked up an hour later, the warped end of the bar was empty, the chipped bowl rinsed and upturned to dry, and underneath it, folded small, was a $20 bill. Most of what a man with a backpacker's budget would have. And on the bar napkin beside it, in a careful hand, 3 words. "Thank you, Nora." She had not told him her name. She stood there a moment, with the napkin in her fingers, and the draft from the warped end touched the back of her neck. And somewhere above her in the dark glass, the neglected larkspur vine she watered when no one was looking, held its breath in the rain. And Nora Bell, who gave everything away and kept almost nothing for herself, folded the napkin once and put it in her apron pocket, where it would stay for 9 days, getting softer, like a thing being worn smooth by being carried. Daniel Hart walked a long way that first night, and the city did not recognize him, which was the only thing it could have given him that he wanted. He went down past the rail yards, where the air smelled of wet iron and creosote, and the cold green rot of the canal, his boots loud on the slick cobbles, and then soft on the towpath mud, and along the water, where the warehouses had been turned into the kind of apartments he could have bought a floor of without checking the price. And he did not stop at any of the hotels, whose lobbies would have stood up when he entered, because he was not ready to be stood up for. The rain had thinned to a fine mist that beaded cold on the back of his neck and tasted faintly of the sea he had walked away from. And somewhere, a late train shunted and coupled with a long iron groan that he felt in his teeth. He had been nobody for 8 months. He had slept on the cold ground above a coastline that did not care who he was, had carried his own water and mended his own boots, and learned again the exact weight of a day spent moving forward on 2 feet. And he had come home specifically to find out whether the boy who had walked into that life was still in there somewhere, under the man the money had built, or whether he had spent him entirely. He had not expected the answer to arrive in a chipped bowl. The grief was the thing he carried, heavier than the pack. Sal Moreno had pulled him out of a dish pit at 18 and fed him and shouted at him and taught him that a kitchen was not a machine for making money, but a room for keeping people alive. And then Sal had grown old, and Daniel had grown busy. Busy in the enormous, important way that men get busy when they are running from something. And he had built and bought and expanded and flown. And one grey morning last autumn, a phone had rung in a glass office, and Sal was gone, quietly, the way the old man did everything, without making Daniel stop for him even once at the end. He could still hear the old man in the dish pit, the first week, shouting over the spray. You feed people first, you charge them after. You remember that, kid, and you can stay forever. And Daniel had remembered it, and built an empire on having forgotten it, which was its own quiet kind of theft. That was the wound. Not that Sal had gone, but Daniel had let the company grow so loud he could no longer hear the one voice that had ever fed him when he had nothing, until the voice was finished, and the silence where it had been was the only thing left to listen to. He had walked 8 months of coastline trying to hear it again, and the only place it had come back to him, faintly, like a kitchen smell under a closed door, was at the bad end of a bar where a waitress had set down a bowl and said, "Don't make it weird." He understood, walking the dark canal, that he was about to do something either very wise or very cowardly, and that the difference between the two would not be clear for 9 days. He had decided not to announce himself. He told himself it was diligence, that a man cannot learn the true condition of a house by walking in as its owner, because the house performs for its owner, straightens its collar, hides its bruises. But somewhere under the canal lights, he let himself admit the rest of it, the part that was not diligence at all. He wanted, for a little while longer, to be a man somebody was kind to because he was a man, and not because he could sign a thing. He had everything a person could buy, and almost nothing a person could not, and the one bowl of beans had reminded him, with a violence that had nearly buckled his knees over the steam, that he was starving for the second kind, and had been for years. He found the napkin in his jacket pocket, where he'd tucked it after writing on the bar, "Thank you, Nora." And he stood under a canal light and looked at his own handwriting and thought, I should not have written her name. I shouldn't know it. And then, but I'm glad I do. And he put it back in his pocket, where it would stay, getting softer, exactly as hers would. 2 people on opposite sides of a glass house, carrying the same 9 days in the same way, without knowing it, like a rhyme neither of them had written on purpose. The Larkspur had been the most beautiful room in the city for 25 years, and Nora had loved it before she had reasons to resent it. She had come at 23, hired by Sal Moreno himself in the last good year, when the old man still walked the floor every night in his rumpled jacket and stopped at every table to ask, in his blunt, warm way, whether people had enough. Sal had built the Larkspur inside a derelict glasshouse that the city had been about to demolish, had threaded vines along the iron ribs of the roof, and planted, by the kitchen door, a single Larkspur, because his wife's name had been Lark and she had not lived to see the place open. He had cooked simple food astonishingly well, and charged what people could pay, and somehow made money anyway. And when he hired Nora, he had looked at her across the empty afternoon dining room and said, "You feed people first. You charge them after. You remember that. You can stay forever." And she had believed him. And for a while, it had been true. Then Sal had grown old, and then last autumn he had grown ill, quietly, the way he did everything. And then he was gone, and the glasshouse passed into the keeping of a company and a board and a brand strategy. And a man named Gideon Pratt arrived with a tablet and a vocabulary. The reality is, Gideon liked to say, the Larkspur has been leaving money on the table for 2 decades. He had said it to the staff at the first all-hands, standing under the Larkspur vine he did not know the name of, and Nora had thought, that's not a table, that's people. And the money, you mean, is the part where they could afford to come. Gideon's plan had a name, Hartwell Reserve, and a deck of slides, and it involved a membership tier and a tasting menu with a price that made the line cooks laugh until they understood he was serious, and a curated guest profile, which was a phrase that meant the backpacker at the door. He had spent the spring trimming. 2 of the old servers were gone. The dishwasher's hours were cut, though Walt had outlasted 3 owners and would, Nora suspected, outlast the heat death of the universe. The family meal had been flagged as unaccounted food cost in a spreadsheet, and only Walt's refusal to acknowledge the spreadsheet's existence had kept the white beans going. And in 9 days, on the night of the Glasshouse's 25th anniversary, the board would vote on whether to make Hartwell Reserve permanent, gut the dining room, and turn Sal's open door into a velvet rope. Gideon had scheduled the vote for the anniversary on purpose, the way he did everything on purpose. He wanted the board to stand in the beautiful room and imagine it more beautiful and more expensive and emptier of everyone who had ever made it warm. Nora knew all of this the way you know the slope of a floor you've worked for years, in her feet, without thinking. What she did not know, on the morning after the backpacker, was why she kept touching the napkin in her apron. "You're somewhere else," Walt observed, not looking up from the dish pit. Walt said most things to the dishes. It spared everyone the eye contact. "I'm right here." Body is. He racked a tray of glasses with the deliberate slowness of a man who had decided, around 1987, that he would never again be hurried by anyone. "Beans went last night. Whole second pot." "We were busy." "We were not busy." Walt finally looked at her, and his eyes were small and bright and very old, and missed nothing. Somebody fed somebody. He let that sit. Tall fella. Pack. Looked like the road chewed him and spat him out polite. Nora went still. "You saw him?" "Saw him." Walt turned back to the pit, and something moved across his weathered face, there and gone, a thought he decided not to have out loud. "Seen worse," he said, which from Walt's was practically a sonnet, and he would say nothing else, though Nora stood there a beat too long waiting, the way Daniel had stood at the door. The way it turned out people in this story kept standing in front of each other, waiting to be seen. The napkin in her apron pocket kept her up that night, and in the small hours, the way the small hours do, it dug up the older things the napkin sat on top of. She did not think of herself as a person with a sad story. She had told Daniel that, and she had meant it. The amputation done so long ago, it no longer hurt at the sight, only ached in weather. But there was a shape to why a folded napkin, with 3 careful words, could undo a woman who fielded heartbreak the way she fielded a dropped fork. And the shape had 2 scenes in it, and at 3 in the morning, she let them come because fighting them cost more sleep than watching them did. The first was the front door, when she was 9. Her mother had not slammed it. That was the part that lasted. There'd been no scene, no shouting, only the small domestic sounds of a person gathering keys and a coat, the jingle, the rasp of a zipper, the smell of her mother's drugstore perfume going out the door with her, like a tide pulling back, and then the latch clicking shut with the ordinary politeness of someone going to the store. Except that she did not come back from the store. Not that night, and not after. And Nora had stood at the window, watching the place where the car had been, and had learned, in the patient way a child learns the truly load-bearing lessons, that love could pick up its keys during an ordinary afternoon, and simply decline to return, and that the only safe response was to need as little as possible from anyone, because the things you need are exactly the things that can be carried out a door while you watch. She had become, that year, the one who fed people. It was not generosity, not at the root. It was insurance. If you are the one who gives, you are never the one waiting at the window. You hold the keys. The second scene was the coat check, and it was smaller, and it was somehow worse. She had been 22, a year before the Larkspur, working the coat check at a hotel ballroom for a charity gala, full of the kind of people the Larkspur would later teach her to recognize by their shoes. And a woman in a gown that cost more than Nora's year, smelling of tuberose and cold champagne, had handed over a wrap heavy as a sleeping cat and warm from her shoulders, and, at the end of the night, retrieving it, had pressed a single coin, still warm from the woman's own glove, into Nora's palm. Not as cruelty, that was the thing. Not even as thought, but as reflex. The way you'd tip a vending machine, if vending machines had hands. And the woman had looked at Nora for exactly the length of the transaction, and not 1/2 second past it. Looked at her, and not seen her. Looked through the place where a person was standing to the coat behind her, and had said, "Thank you, dear," to the coat, and walked away. Nora had stood there, with the coin going warm in her fist, and understood that there was a whole class of human being to whom she was furniture that occasionally proved useful, and that the safest thing was to agree with them before they could inform her, to decide, first, herself, that she was the help, so that no one could ever do it to her again with a coin. And Brett had been the proof. Brett, who had loved her for 2 years, and left in one sentence, the night she'd told him she was tired and wanted, just once, to be taken care of instead of doing the taking care. Brett had looked at her with something between pity and relief and said, "Nora, you don't need anybody. It's honestly the thing I always liked about you." And had picked up his keys, ordinary as an afternoon. And Nora had stood at another window and watched another place where a car had been, and had thought, Of course the thing they like is that I need nothing. Of course, the moment I want something, I become a person they can leave. And she had folded that up small too, and put it where she put things, and gone to work the next day, and fed everybody, and kept almost nothing, and built a small, careful life, with the keys always in her own fist, and had, genuinely, mostly, believed she was happy, right up until a tired stranger she thought had nothing left, her a napkin with her name on it, and asked her, in the rain, what she wanted. And the keys had started, very quietly, to feel less like safety, and more like a thing she was holding so tightly, she'd forgotten she could open anything with them. She finally slept near dawn, the napkin under her pillow like a girl with a tooth, and she did not let herself name the hope, because naming it would make it a thing she could lose. He came back the next day, in the slow hour, with the rain. Nora was carrying a tray of polished glasses across the room when she saw the canvas jacket at the warped end of the bar, and something in her chest did a thing it had no business doing, and she nearly fumbled the tray. And Camille, who had elevated noticing other people's fumbles into an art form, said, "Careful," in a tone that meant she had seen everything. "I didn't think you'd come back," Nora said, setting the glasses down by his elbow. "Most people only get thrown out of a place once before they take the hint." "I didn't get thrown out," Daniel said. "I got fed." He turned the water glass its quarter turn. "I came to pay it back, and to find out if it was a one-time thing or if this place is—" He searched, and the careful voice slowed. "If it's still the kind of place where that can happen." "It's not a place where that can happen," Nora said. "It's a place where I happen, and I'm probably getting fired for it, so eat fast." But she was already reaching for the bowl. He stayed 2 hours that day. He asked her things, not the things men at the bar usually asked, which were about themselves with her face attached, but real things, oddly specific things. How long the vines had been up there, whether the second oven still ran hot on the left, whether the floor by the kitchen door still had the dip in it that caught a tray cart's wheel. She answered, laughing a little, because how would a backpacker know to ask about the dip in the floor?
And he said he'd worked restaurants here and there on the road, the kind of work a person can pick up anywhere with 2 hands and no questions. And that was the first thing he told her that was almost a lie. And she heard the almost in it and let it go, because everyone at a bar is allowed one. "What do you want?" he asked her near the end. And she answered automatically, "Another 20 like the one you left. My rent's due." And he didn't laugh.
"No," he said. "That's what you need. I asked what you want." And Nora, who fielded the question the way she fielded a dropped fork, bend, retrieve, move on, found she had nothing in her hands. She busied herself with the well. "Nobody's asked me that since I was about 9, she said, lightly, and the lightness didn't land. And she felt him notice it didn't land. And she changed the subject the way she tightened her apron strings with a small, efficient yank, and told him the soup was getting cold. But that night, closing up, she stood under the dark spine of the glass house and looked at the half-ruined larkspur vine by the kitchen door, the one Sal had planted, the one nobody on the spreadsheet knew was there. And she watered it from a pint glass, which she did most nights, secretly, because someone should. And for the first time in years, she let herself finish the question. What did she want? She wanted a small green place of her own, a nursery, a few cold frames, rows of things she had coaxed up from seed, soil under her nails for a reason that was hers. She had wanted it since she was a girl, with a windowsill of cuttings in jam jars, before she became the person who carried other people's wants across a dining room on a tray. She had never said it aloud to a living soul, and she did not say it aloud now, but she thought it clearly, once, like setting down something heavy. And the larkspur vine drank its pint glass of water in the dark and asked nothing of her in return, which was, she realized, exactly why she could bear to love it. The 3rd day he was early, which she pretended not to be glad about, and the 4th day she was early, which he pretended not to notice. And that was how it went. 2 people arriving ahead of a thing they were each telling themselves was nothing. The slow hour at the larkspur had a texture all its own. The long gold room half-lit, the candles unlit, the prep clatter coming muffled through the pass, the smell of stock and bread and the green, vegetal breath of the vines overhead. And into that texture the 2 of them built, without naming it, a private country with a population of 2 and Walt as its silent border guard. They had their jokes by then, the small, dumb, durable jokes that are the load-bearing walls of anything real. There was the lamp. Gideon had installed, at the host stand, an enormous brass and frosted glass fixture that he called a statement light, and that Nora and Daniel agreed, in lowered voices, looked exactly like a street lamp that had been to finishing school and come back insufferable. And they had developed an entire backstory for it, the lamp's tragic ambitions, the lamp's disappointment in all of them, until Nora could not walk past it without her mouth twitching, and Daniel could undo her entirely across the room, with nothing but a grave little nod at it, as if offering the lamp his condolences. And there was the house special that isn't a special, which had become a code between them for the whole secret tender economy of the place. The off-menu beans, the heel of bread, the chair nobody was supposed to sit in, the kindness Gideon's spreadsheet could not find a column for. 2 of the house special that isn't a special, Daniel would murmur when she came by, and she would say, "Chef's overwhelmed, could be a wait," and bring it in under a minute. And it was the stupidest exchange in the world, and she found herself thinking about it on the bus home. What she noticed, across those 2 days, was that he was lonely in a way she recognized, because it was the shape of her own loneliness turned inside out. Hers came from carrying too many people. His came from carrying none. He had the stillness of a man who had not been touched on the arm in a long time, who flinched, very slightly, the first time she steadied his shoulder to lean past him for the well, and then went so carefully motionless afterward, as if afraid that moving would make it stop. He ate slowly, because slowly meant longer. He asked his strange, precise questions. The second oven, the dip in the floor, whether Walt still hummed the same 4 bars of the same old song over the dish pit. And she answered them, and watched something in his face settle each time, the way a person settles when a place they were afraid had changed turns out to still be itself underneath. On the 4th day, she said, testing, "You ask about this place like you're checking on a relative in a hospital." And Daniel went still, and then did a thing she had not seen him do, which was reach for a joke instead of a wall. "I am," he said. "It's my great art. Terrible woman. Wildly expensive. Left me nothing in the will but the bar tab. It was clumsy, the timing a half beat off, the joke of a man badly out of practice. And that was exactly why it undid her. Because she could see him deciding to be funny instead of safe, could see the effort of it, a man learning a language late and getting the grammar almost right. And she laughed, surprised, the real laugh, the one that came up from somewhere she kept locked. And Daniel looked as astonished as a man who has struck a match in the wind and watched it actually catch. "There it is," he said quietly, almost to himself. "There what is?" "Nothing." He turned the water glass its quarter turn. "I read somewhere it's good for a person to make 1 joke a day. Doctor's orders. I'm rationing." That was today's. It was a bad joke. It was a brave joke, he corrected, and held her eyes a beat too long. And she had to go refill the salt cellars that did not need refilling, and Walt, racking glasses at the speed of erosion, watched the whole exchange and set down a tumbler very softly and did not say a word, though the corner of his ancient mouth did something it had not done since approximately the second Reagan administration. That night she carried the durable, stupid jokes home with her on the bus, the lamp and the great aunt, and the house special that isn't a special, and she caught herself smiling at the dark window, and she thought, with the old reflexive flinch, "Careful." And then, more quietly, in a voice she barely let herself hear, "Why?" And she had no answer, which frightened her more than a bad one would have. She started saving him the table. Not the bar, the table. Table 13, the wobbly two-top by the kitchen door that nobody wanted because of the draft and the dip in the floor. The one Gideon's reservation system listed as out of inventory. She'd shim it with a folded comment card and seat Daniel there in the slow hour with his pack on the empty chair like a dinner companion, and bring him the beans, and steal the minutes between her tables to stand and talk to him with one hand on the chair back. And the thing between them grew, the way the most dangerous things grow, which is slowly, and disguised as something harmless. He told her about the road. He'd walked a long coastal trail, north to south, 8 months of it, alone, after, and here the careful voice would close like a hand, after he lost someone, he said, someone who'd taught him everything, the only person who'd ever fed him when he had nothing, and he'd needed to remember how to be a person who carried his own weight and slept on the ground and was nobody to anybody. She told him about Eli, her half-brother, 16 and elbows and appetite, the boy her father had left in her keeping at 19, when he became a phone call that sometimes happened and then mostly didn't. How Eli wanted to be a chef now because of a video and would set fire to the apartment trying to caramelize sugar. How she worked doubles so he could stay in the school with the good robotics program. How he was the one good, clean thing she'd made. "You raised a kid," Daniel said, "while serving rich strangers their dinner. Since you were 19, it's not a sad story." She said it fast, automatically, the way she'd learned to amputate sympathy before it could spread. "Lots of people do harder. I had a job and an apartment and a kid who's basically a genius, so—" "I didn't say it was sad," Daniel said. "I said you raised a kid." He turned the water glass. "There's a difference between a thing being sad and a thing being heavy. You keep hearing the first one. I'm saying the second." She had to go check on table 6 after that, and she stood in the wine alcove for a full minute with her back to the room, pressing her thumb hard against the spine of a bottle before she could trust her face again. Walt watched all of it from the pit, saying nothing, drying glasses with the slowness of geological time. On the 5th day, Eli came by after school to catch dinner and meet the bean guy his sister wouldn't shut up about, which Nora denied with her ears going hot. And Eli sat across from Daniel at table 13, and within 10 minutes was deep in an explanation of Maillard reactions, delivered with the grave intensity of a young man who has recently discovered that the universe is, objectively, extremely cool. So the browning is basically chemistry, Eli concluded, which is objectively the coolest part of cooking. No offense to my sister, who thinks the coolest part is not getting yelled at. None taken, Daniel said. Though both matter. You can do the chemistry perfectly and still cook food nobody wants to eat, if the room's wrong. He nodded at the glasshouse around them, the gold light coming up now in the iron ribs. The chemistry's just the start. The hard part is making a person feel like they're allowed to be here. Eli considered this with the full weight of 16. You sound like you've thought about restaurants a lot for a guy with a backpack. I've thought about restaurants more than almost anything, Daniel said. And it was completely true, and Eli had no way to hear how true. And Nora, refilling water 2 tables over, missed it. And Walt, racking glasses 30 feet away, did not. And the old dishwasher set down a tumbler very carefully and looked across the room at the road-worn man at the worst table in the house. And the look on Walt's face was the look of a man watching a ghost decide whether to come home. The 6th day was when it started to go wrong, which is to say, it was when other people noticed that something had gone right. Gideon Pratt noticed. He noticed the way he noticed everything, as a line item. He came onto the floor in the slow hour with a guest he was courting, a board member named Ms. Asher, who controlled 3 votes, and wore the kind of quiet, expensive grey that costs more than a car. And he was walking her through the room, narrating his vision, velvet rope here, chef's counter there, when he saw the backpacker at table 13, with a chipped bowl and a teenager and a waitress laughing with one hand on the chair. And Nora watched his face do the cold arithmetic and arrive at a number he did not like. Excuse me one moment, Gideon said to Ms. Asher, and crossed the room with his smile on like a tie clip. Nora, a word. He didn't lower his voice enough. We don't seat. His eyes flicked over Daniel, the jacket, the pack, the boots, and dismissed all of it. Walk-ins at full tables during service. And that table's out of inventory. It was empty, Nora said. He's eating staff meal. He pays, he tips. He's quieter than table 4, who I'd happily put out on the curb. That's not the point. Gideon's smile tightened a degree. The point is the room. The reality is this. A small gesture that took in Daniel, Eli, the bowl, the whole warm, crooked scene, is not the guest profile we're building toward. Going forward, the bar end is for guests like this, if we seat them at all. He turned the last part toward Daniel directly, the way you'd address a draft you intended to fix. No offense, friend. It's a business. Nora opened her mouth, and what came out of it was going to get her fired. She could feel it forming. And it would have, except that Daniel set down his spoon. He didn't stand. He didn't raise the careful voice. He looked up at Gideon with that tired, attentive brown gaze, the gaze that had been reading the building for 6 days, and he said, mildly, "What did Sal Moreno charge for the white beans?" Gideon blinked. "Who?" And there it was. Nora saw it cross Daniel's face. Not anger, something worse. Something that looked like grief wearing a calm coat. The moment a man learns that the person running the house he built does not know the name of the man who built it. Nothing. Daniel answered his own question quietly. He charged nothing for the white beans. They were for the staff and for anyone who walked in hungry. He used to say you feed people first and charge them after. I imagine that's the kind of thing that looks like money left on the table, if you're reading the table wrong. He picked his spoon back up. No offense, friend. It's a business. Gideon stared at him for a moment, recalibrating. The way a man recalibrates when a thing he had filed under nuisance turns out to have teeth. Then he produced a laugh, brittle this time, and said, "We're modernizing," and "Nora, the bar going forward," and steered Ms. Asher away toward the chef's counter and his vision, and the gold light came up in the glasshouse. And at table 13, a billionaire in a backpacker's jacket ate the last of his beans, with his hand not quite steady. And the waitress, who had defended a man she thought had nothing, sat down across from him without being asked, which she had never once done during service in 4 years, and said, "How do you know about Sal?" "I knew him," Daniel said. "A long time ago. On the road you meet people. You hear things." 3 almosts now, stacked, and she heard all 3. And for the first time she felt the shape of what she wasn't being told, like a body under a sheet. And she should have pulled the sheet back then. And she didn't. Because the alternative to not knowing was knowing. And some part of her had already decided she wanted these 9 days more than she wanted the truth. "You should go," she said gently. "Before he writes it up. I mean it. I'll save you beans tomorrow, out back, off the books, like a normal fugitive." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "Why do you do that?" "Do what?" "Take care of everyone but yourself. You just sat down for the first time in 4 years to protect a stranger, and you're already standing back up." She was. She hadn't noticed. She sat back down, slowly, like a dare. "Maybe I'm not very good at being taken care of," she said, and it was the most naked thing she had said to anyone in years, and she said it to a man whose last name she did not know, in the worst seat in the house, and outside the rain stopped, and a thin evening sun came through the glass and laid itself across the dip in the floor, and the half-ruined larkspur vine, and Daniel's worn boots, and lit, for a moment, the whole crooked, beautiful, doomed thing she had built her small happiness on, without permission. It was late, after the close, when Nora saw the thing about Camille that she would not understand the worth of until much later. She had gone back for her phone, left charging in the cramped staff alcove behind the coat racks, and she came around the corner on stocking feet, her shoes in her hand, and stopped, because Camille was there and did not know she was watched. Camille, who held the host stand like a fortress, who said, fully committed to tired men in the rain in a voice that was sorry about nothing, who wore her armor of crisp black and perfect lipstick, the way other people wore skin, was sitting on the upturned milk crate by the lockers with her shoes off and her perfect posture gone, and she had her one good blazer across her knees, the black one she wore on the nights that mattered, and she was mending the lining of it with a tiny hotel sewing kit, the kind you take from a room you are not paying for, her mouth full of pins, squinting under the bad bulb, her fingers careful and quick and practiced, in a way that told the whole story by itself. That this was the only good blazer, that it had been mended before, that the armor was not bought new every season, the way it looked like it must be, but kept alive by exactly this: a milk crate and a stolen sewing kit, and a refusal to let anyone see the seams. And on the bench beside her was one of the staff rolls, Walt's bread, still giving off its faint yeasted warmth in the cold alcove. The bread Camille made a point of declining at family meal with a small, refined wince. The bread she had told them all she didn't eat. And half of it was gone. Torn, not cut. Eaten quietly, hungrily, alone, after everyone had left. A few crumbs caught in the wool of the blazer across her knees. Nora stood very still in the dark of the coat racks. She understood, in the way you understand a thing all at once with your whole body, before your mind has agreed to it, that Camille was not a different kind of person than she was, that the lipstick and the posture and the sorry-about-nothing voice were a costume sewn over the same milk crate Nora had been hiding her whole life, that Camille had simply chosen the opposite disguise. Nora performed having nothing, so no one could take anything, and Camille performed having everything, so no one could see she had almost the same. two women keeping the same secret in opposite languages across the same beautiful room. She did not say anything. There are kindnesses that are bowls of beans, and there are kindnesses that are silences. And Nora had a gift for both, and she gave Camille the second one. She slipped her phone off the charger without a sound and went back the way she'd come, and let Camille mend her armor in private, and she would not think about it again for 3 days. Until the night Camille stood up in front of the board and told the truth, and lost the captain's promotion for it. And Nora, hearing of it later, would not be surprised, because she had already seen, under a bad bulb on a milk crate, exactly how much Camille was willing to pay to be able to sleep at night, once somebody finally made it possible. That night, Walt stopped her at the back door. He had his coat on, the same coat for 30 years, and he stood under the bare bulb of the service hallway with his hands in his pockets, and he said, "You water that vine." It wasn't a question. Nothing, Walt said, was a question. "Somebody should," Nora said. Walt looked at the floor, at the larkspur, at the door the road-worn man had gone out of an hour before. "You know who planted it. Sal, for his wife." "Sal." Walt nodded slowly. "And you've been the one watering it since. You." Nobody else looked. He let that sit. Then his voice changed, went somewhere further back. "There was a boy planted his whole self by that door, years before you. Dishwasher to floor to..." He stopped himself, the way Daniel stopped himself, the way they all stopped themselves in this story, on the lip of the true thing. "Boy started in my pit," Walt said instead, to the floor. 18 years old. Nothing to his name but 2 good hands and a temper about hungry people. He looked up at Nora, and his small, bright old eyes were wet at the rims, and he said the most words she had ever heard him say at once. "Some people come home in a nice car, so you'll know they made it. And some people come home in their old boots, because they want to find out who you are before you find out who they are. You be careful which kind of careful you are with that one." And he put his cap on and went out into the night, leaving Nora alone in the service hallway with a sentence she could not yet read, the way you can't read your own handwriting in the dark. The 7th day did not happen at the restaurant. It rained all morning, a soft, grey, ceaseless rain, and Daniel was waiting outside the staff entrance when Nora came out at the end of the lunch shift, and he said, "I have the afternoon. So do you. I check the schedule through the window like a stalker. Walk with me?" And she said the thing she always said, which was that she had errands, and he said, "Then I'll carry the bags." And somehow that was that, and they walked. He took her, of all places, to the old plant market under the rail bridge, the one she'd loved since she was a kid, the sprawling, damp Saturday market of cuttings and seedlings and old men arguing about tomatoes. Except it was a Tuesday, and half shut and almost empty, which made it better. She didn't ask how he knew she'd love it. She would understand, later, that he hadn't known, that he'd taken her there because he loved it himself, had as a boy, that they had grown up 9 streets and a handful of years apart, loving the same wet green underpass, and that this was the first thing they had in common that neither of them had performed. She talked more than she had talked in years. She told him about the cuttings and jam jars, about the windowsill, about the nursery she wanted and would never have, the little green place. And she heard herself say it out loud, what she wanted, for the first time since she was 9. And the rain came down on the corrugated roof of the market, and a vendor's radio played something old, and Daniel listened with his whole tired face. And when she ran out of words, she felt scoured and light and terrified. They walked the half-shut market slowly, because neither of them had anywhere to be, and both of them knew it, and neither said it. The Tuesday version of the place was a secret one, the weekend crowds gone, the aisles under the rail bridge dim and dripping, and smelling of wet earth and bruised basil, and the particular green that comes off 1,000 crowded living things in a damp space. An old man at a stall of tomato seedlings was arguing about grafting with no one, possibly a ghost, possibly himself. And he looked up at Nora and said, "You've got the hands for it." Apropos of nothing, having watched her, without being asked, pinch a leggy seedling back at its node, the way you do without thinking when you have done it your whole life. And Nora flushed and put the plant down, and Daniel watched the whole thing, the way a man watches a thing he is going to remember on purpose. She showed him things, because he asked, and because no one ever asked. She showed him how to tell a root-bound plant by the weight and the way the soil had pulled from the pot's edge. She showed him which of the cuttings on the dollar table would take, and which were already gone, the difference invisible to him and obvious to her. A fluency he had no name for, and she had never thought to call a skill, because no one had ever paid her for it. "You're reading them," he said, watching her hands. "Like I read a room." And she said, "It's the same thing. You just have to be quiet enough to hear what a thing needs, and patient enough to give it before it asks." And she heard, a half-second after she said it, that she had described herself, the whole of herself, and that she had been doing it for people for free for years, and had never once turned the gift back on her own life. And the old vendor's radio played something with a fiddle in it, and the rain came harder on the corrugated roof. And Daniel did not say anything, because he had heard it too, and he had the grace to let her hear herself, without an audience clapping. There was a moment by the cold frames at the far end, packets of seed in a wooden box, the names of them like a poem nobody reads anymore, Larkspur and Love in a Mist and Sweet William and Snapdragon, when she put her hand flat on the lid of the box the way you'd put a hand on a sleeping animal, and her face did a thing she did not know it did, went open and young and hungry and unguarded, the face of the girl with the jam jars before the world taught her to perform having nothing. And Daniel saw it, the whole nursery she would never let herself have, written plainly across her features for one unprotected second. And something in his chest that had been walking for 8 months finally sat down. He did not tell her then that he was already, quietly, behind his careful brown eyes, building it for her in his mind, in a corner he knew by a kitchen door, where the light came down through old glass all afternoon. He just bought the seed packets, all of them, before she could say it was a waste, and pressed them into her hand and said, "For the windowsill. A man's allowed to buy a friend some seeds." And she let him, which was its own small, enormous thing. Nora Bell letting somebody give her something that grew. "You'd be good at it," he said. "You already are. You've been running a place that feeds people on no money for years. You just don't own it. It's a daydream. I have a kid and rent and a job I'm about to lose." "It's a plan you haven't let yourself make," Daniel said. "Because making it would mean you'd let yourself want something, and you've decided wanting things is for other people." He said it gently, with no cruelty in it at all, and it went into her like a key into a lock she didn't know she'd had. "I know the trick. I do it too. It's safer to need than to want. Need is a fact. Want is a risk." "And what do you want?" she shot back, the way you swing when you've been hit. "Mr. Backpacker, what does the man with one jacket want?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, turning something over in his fingers. She saw it now. A small battered brass thing, a bottle opener worn smooth. He carried it the way she carried the napkin. And then he said, "I want to find out if the best thing I ever made still has a heart in it, or if I let it turn into the kind of place that throws tired people out in the rain." He looked at her. "I think I found out." She didn't understand it. She filed it under the strange poetry of a man who'd walked 8 months alone. They bought a single larkspur seedling because she couldn't not, a frail green thing in a paper pot. And on the walk back, they stood under the rail bridge to let a downpour pass, close together in the dark, dripping arch, not touching, and the air between them was so charged she could have lit the market on it. And he turned to her, and didn't kiss her, which was somehow more than a kiss, and said, "Nora, when you find out some things about me, and you will, I need you to remember today. Will you remember today?" "You're being weird again," she said, but her voice had gone soft. "Promise me you'll remember that I asked what you wanted before I knew anything could come of it. That part's true no matter what else turns out to be complicated." "Okay," she said. "I'll remember the underpass." And she meant it as a small thing, and it would turn out to be the only handhold she had, the very next night, on the worst night of her life. "Now stop, you're ruining a perfectly good rainstorm with foreshadowing." He laughed then, a real one, surprised out of him, the road-worn, careful man, laughing in the rain with a frail larkspur seedling between them. And it was the first joke she'd heard him land, the first time he'd been funny instead of kind. And she thought, "Oh no." And she thought, "There it is." And the rain came down, and the seedling held up its 2 new leaves to it, and asked nothing of anyone. The 8th day, the trap closed. It closed the way these things do, not with malice, but with a calendar. Gideon had scheduled a pre-anniversary walkthrough, the board in the room, the night before the vote, to experience the guest journey, meaning to be flattered into voting yes. He'd brought in event lighting and a string trio and a stack of the new menus, the Hartwell Reserve menus, the ones with the prices that had made the line cooks laugh, and he'd staffed the floor with the front-of-house people he could trust to perform. And he had told Nora, flatly, that she was on bar-back and beans duty in the kitchen tonight, out of the room, because, and he didn't say it, but she heard it, because she was not the guest profile either. Not anymore. Not since she'd sat down at table 13. She didn't fight it. She was tired, and she had a frail seedling on her windowsill at home, and she had decided, some private hour the night before, that the smart thing, the safe thing, was to let the 9 days be a closed and perfect thing, like the napkin in her pocket, and to not find out what was under the sheet. So she was in the kitchen, plating the staff meal for a staff that wasn't being fed tonight because the family meal was paused for the event, which she was doing anyway, off the books, like a normal fugitive, when she heard the room go quiet on the other side of the doors. The good quiet. The quiet of arrival. The board had come in. And then she heard Gideon's voice climb up smooth and triumphant. "And of course, the heart of the rebrand, the man whose vision we're honoring, the founder of the Hartwell Group, who I'm told is back in the city after his sabbatical. Let's hope he graces us." And she heard Ms. Asher, the grey board member, say, in a tone of mild society interest, "Is it true he started here, in the kitchen?" And she heard Gideon say, "A charming origin story, yes. Daniel Hart, dishwasher to billionaire. Very on brand." And Nora's hands went still on the plate, because there was a name attached to the beans now. A last name. And it was Daniel. And the room tilted very slightly on the slope she knew in her feet. She pushed through the doors with a plate she had no reason to be carrying, just to see, just to prove the cruel coincidence wrong. The board stood in a cluster of grey and gold by the chef's counter, under Gideon's beautiful event lighting. And by the kitchen door, by the dip in the floor, by the half-ruined larkspur vine, in a clean shirt but the same worn boots, holding his battered brass bottle opener in fingers that were not quite steady, stood the backpacker. Stood Daniel, looking at her, only at her, with an expression that was already an apology, already a hand reaching, already too late. "Ah," said Gideon, into the silence, and his smile when he understood was the worst thing Nora had ever seen. A smile of pure, delighted recalculation, because the line item had turned out to be the owner, and he had thrown the owner out of his own restaurant in the rain. And the only person who'd been kind had been Nora. And Gideon's mind was already rewriting all of it to land on the right side. "Mr. Hart, sir, we didn't... You came in, you've been coming in, that's..." A glance at Nora, lethal. Wonderful. Marvelous. The founder, experiencing his own... "Don't," Daniel said, quietly, to Gideon. But he was looking at Nora. And Nora stood in the middle of the most beautiful room in the city, holding a plate of beans nobody was going to eat. And she felt the whole 9 days rearrange themselves behind her eyes into a shape she could not bear. The shape was this: the man she had fed for free, the man she had defended to her boss, the man she had sat down across from for the first time in 4 years, the man who had asked her what she wanted and made her say it out loud in the rain. That man owned everything: the glasshouse, the climbing vine, the laminated card with the rule about the bar, her job, the corner she watered in secret. Her. He had walked in dressed as nothing to find out who people really were when they believed he was nothing. And she had passed his test. That was the part that hollowed her where she stood, the steam rising off a plate of beans into the gold light. That there had been a test at all. That her warmth had been a thing he was measuring. And that her wanting, the nursery and the jam jars and the most secret room inside her, she had handed across a wobbly two-top to the richest man in the building, like a fool, turning out her pockets to prove she had nothing worth taking. He had been studying her, and she had been. Exactly as Brett had said the night he left. Exactly as the woman at the long-ago coat check had made her feel with one coin and one look. Exactly as she had always feared down in the cold place where the lie lived. The help. The entertainment. A charming origin story for somebody else's brand. She did not rage. Walt would tell her later that he'd watched, and that she did not rage, and that this was how he knew it had gone deep. Because Nora fought when she had hope, and went quiet when she didn't. She set the plate of beans down on table 13, very gently, beside the empty chair where his pack used to sit. "You asked me what I wanted," she said, and her voice was steady and terrible. "And I told you. And you already owned the room I told you in." Nora. Was it a good show? She wasn't crying. That was the worst part, the dry steadiness of it. "Did I test well? Tell Mr. Pratt I'm sorry I'm off-brand. Tell the board the help recommends the white beans." She untied her apron. The strings gave with one efficient yank. The napkin was in the pocket. She left it there. She set the apron on the chair where the pack used to be. "I hope you find your heart, Mr. Hart," she said. "It's a beautiful room. It always was. It was beautiful before it was yours, and it'll be beautiful after. And none of that was ever about me. And I let myself forget that for about a week, which is the most expensive thing I've ever done. And I didn't even get a receipt." And she walked out through the kitchen, past Walt, who reached out one old hand and touched her shoulder for exactly 1 second, which from Walt was an embrace, and out the back door into the rain. And she did not look back. And behind her, in the most beautiful room in the city, a billionaire stood by the dip in the floor, with a worn brass bottle opener going still in his hand. And the board murmured, and Gideon smiled, and the half-ruined larkspur vine that no one on the spreadsheet knew was there dropped one of its few exhausted leaves onto the apron Nora had left on the chair. She did not go to work the next day. She told herself it was because she'd quit, which she had, more or less, by leaving her apron on a chair. But the truth was, she could not have walked back into that room if they'd paid her the Hartwell Reserve tasting menu price to do it. She sat in her small apartment, with the frail larkspur seedling on the windowsill, and Eli's robotics half-built on the table. And she let herself, for 1 hour, believe the worst thing. She practiced it the way she'd been taught to practice the worst thing as a girl, so it couldn't surprise you. Maybe he really was just slumming. Maybe the kindness meter was running the whole time. Maybe a man like that walks into the lives of people like me the way he walked into the restaurant, to feel something. And then he goes home, and we're the something he felt. She said it to the seedling. The seedling held up its 2 leaves. She had bought it with him in the rain, and she could not look at it, and she could not throw it out. So she set a coffee mug in front of it on the sill, so she wouldn't have to see it. And that, somehow, was when she finally cried. Over a coffee mug, in the grey light, with her brother's robot watching with its one unfinished eye. He left like 9 messages, Eli said carefully from the doorway. He was 16 and out of his depth and trying so hard. I didn't read them. The bean guy. Daniel. He couldn't say billionaire either. It was too big for the kitchen of their apartment. You want me to delete them? Yes, Nora said. And then, no. And then nothing, which was the truest answer. Eli went away and was quiet for a long time in the kitchen, which was unlike him, the boy who narrated serial. And Nora sat with the coffee mug and the seedling she couldn't look at, and let the worst hour do its work. She was good at the worst hour. She had been training for it since she was 9, since the front door had closed on the sound of her mother's car, and her father had become a number that sometimes rang. Since she had learned that the way to survive a thing being taken is to have already, in private, given it up. So she gave Daniel up. She took the 9 days out and looked at them the way you look at a burn, to see how deep. The bowl, the bar, the great aunt joke, the lamp, the underpass, the frail seedling in its paper pot. Had any of it been real, or had she just been a warm exhibit in a rich man's experiment? She made herself say the cold, true sentence, the one the lie had been whispering since she was a girl, and that the 9 days had nearly talked her out of believing. You are worth what you are useful for, and nothing past it. She had been useful to him, a charming origin story, a test he could pass through her, and then she'd stopped being useful. And here she was, exactly where the LIE had always promised she'd end up, alone in a small kitchen with a mug in front of a flower. It was the smell that found her first, after a while. Onions. Then the low, patient smell of beans, of a ham hock that wasn't a ham hock, because they didn't have one, but Eli had improvised with the end of a smoked something from the back of the fridge. And greens, slightly wrong, slightly his own. She came to the kitchen doorway and found her brother standing over their dented pot with a wooden spoon and the grave, terrified concentration of a 16-year-old doing the only thing he could think of, which was to make her, from memory, badly, with love, the white beans. He had asked Daniel once how the staff meal got its depth, and Daniel had told him, and Eli had filed it away, the way he filed everything. And now, he was trying to put a roof back on his sister, with the soup he'd reverse-engineered from one overheard conversation. It's probably bad, Eli said, not turning around, his voice careful. I didn't have the right. It's probably bad. But you always feed everybody, and nobody ever... He stopped, 16 and out of his depth, and so far past it. I wanted to feed you. For once. That's all. And that was the thing that finally broke the cold sentence in half. Nora crossed the small kitchen and put her arms around her brother from behind while he stirred, and pressed her face between his bony shoulder blades, and let herself be, for the length of one pot of imperfect beans. A person somebody fed. She had spent her whole life believing the lie, because the lie was safe. Because if you are only worth your usefulness, then at least you are in control of your own worth. You can earn it. You can carry more. You can never be left holding a flower in the rain. But wasn't that the oldest trick the lie had? That the safest cage is the one you build and lock from the inside. Because here was a boy who could not cook. Cooking. Here was the truest fact in the room, and it had nothing to do with whether she was useful. He had not made the beans because she'd earned them. He'd made them because he loved her. Full stop. No spreadsheet, no column, no receipt. The beans were, in fact, bad. They ate them anyway, both of them, at the small table beside the half-built robot with its one unfinished eye. And Nora discovered that she could believe the worst thing about Daniel and the best thing about her brother at the same time, in the same hour, and that the second one did not need the first one to be false. Maybe Daniel had used her. She would survive it. She had survived worse with less. But the cold sentence she had carried since she was 9, that the loving of her was always a transaction, that she would only ever be the help in someone else's beautiful room. That sentence was not, it turned out, true, because it was being disproved in real time by a 16-year-old and a dented pot. And a thing you can watch being disproved in your own kitchen is a thing you can finally, carefully, set down. What did she want from Daniel Hart? She did not know yet, and she let herself not know, which was its own small mercy. But for the first time since the apron strings gave, she knew, with a steadiness that surprised her, what she was worth. And it was not a number, and no one in any beautiful room got to set it, but her. Daniel Hart did not send a 10th message. He had learned something on 8 months of trail and a longer apprenticeship before it, which was that some apologies are made of words, and the cheap ones always are. And that a man who could buy anything had to be very careful never to buy his way out of the one thing he'd actually broken. So he did not send flowers, which he could afford by the truckload, and he did not send money, which would have confirmed every cruel thing she'd practiced at her windowsill. And he did not show up at her door. Because showing up at the door of a woman who has run from you is a thing powerful men do. And he was trying, at 33, finally, to stop being the kind of powerful man the world had made him into, to protect the boy who'd been thrown out of a restaurant in the rain. It was the hardest restraint of his life, and he had climbed cliffs in storms. Every instinct 15 years had built in him said fix it the way you fix everything, with reach, with weight, with a number large enough to make the problem agree to disappear. He could have had the nursery she'd never told anyone she wanted, built and deeded to her by the weekend. He could have had a courier standing at her door inside the hour with an envelope that solved her rent for a decade. He sat in a borrowed apartment that did not look like a billionaire's because he had not wanted one that did. Bare floors, the smell of fresh paint and cold coffee, a radiator that knocked twice an hour like a knuckle on a door. And he held his battered brass bottle opener and turned it over and over, its worn edge warm and smooth under his thumb. The one Sal had given him the day he made line cook. Your own opener, kid, so you never have to ask anybody for one. And he made himself not reach for any of it, because every single one of those reaches would have proven her right. Money was the only language he was truly fluent in, and the woman he had broken was the one person on earth who would correctly hear it as the language of a man buying his way out of a thing he should have to feel. So he sat with the feeling instead, which he was very out of practice at. And the feeling told him things. It told him that she had not been wrong about the test, not exactly, that he had walked in disguised precisely to see what people did when they thought he was nobody, and that this had been a kind of test, even if he had never aimed it at her, and that being accidentally tested is no comfort to a person who has spent her life being measured. It told him that he had let her say the most secret thing she owned out loud in the rain while standing inside a building he held the deed to, and that the unfairness of that was real, no matter how true his own feeling had been, because he had known and she had not. And knowledge is a kind of money too, and he had been the only rich man in that underpass. And it told him, last and worst, that fixing the restaurant would not fix any of it, that he could put the door back and the beans back and her job back and still lose her, that a one room was not a one woman, and that for the first time since he was 18 and cold, there was a thing he wanted that no amount of him could acquire. which left only the small things, the true things, the slow ones. He went to see Walt once in those days, not at the restaurant, but at the old dishwasher's narrow house with its yard full of tomato cages, and he did not announce himself as anything, just knocked, and Walt opened the door and looked at the man the boy had become standing on his step in the worn boots, and said, after a long while, "Took you long enough," and let him in, and made him terrible coffee. The two of them sat in the small kitchen that smelled of soil and the past, and Walt told him plainly what he had not let himself know, that he, Daniel, had not lost his way at the trail or at Sal's funeral, but years before, gradually, the way a kitchen goes cold, not all at once, but one cut server, one paused family meal, one velvet rope at a time. And that the road had not fixed him, that a road never fixes anybody. It only takes the noise away long enough for a man to hear what he already knew. "You knew the day they printed that card about the bar," Walt said. "You signed off on it from an airplane. I expect you didn't read it." Daniel had not read it. "She read it," Walt said. "She read it, and then she broke the rule on it the first night a tired man stood in the door. That's the whole difference between you and her, son. And you can't buy across it. You can only walk." And then Walt, who hated speeches and had just made two, refilled the terrible coffee and would say nothing else. And Daniel went home and did not sleep. And in the morning, he understood exactly what he had to do, both at the board and, harder, on a landing in the rain. The board came first. He went to war with his own. The anniversary came. The glass house filled with the people Gideon had curated, grey and gold. The string trio, the event lighting making the iron ribs gleam. The new Hartwell Reserve menus stacked and waiting like a verdict. And at the moment Gideon rose to present the vote, to honor the founder's legacy by elevating it, Daniel Hart stood up first, in a good suit and the same worn boots, and asked the room a question instead. "How many of you," he said, in the careful voice that the whole board leaned in to hear because it was so rarely raised, "have eaten the white beans?" Nobody had. "Sal Marino built this room," Daniel said, "and he hired me out of the dish pit when I was 18, and I'd just been thrown out of a restaurant across town for not being able to afford a glass of water. Thrown out in the rain in front of a girl I wanted to impress. And I have spent 15 years and built a company so that would never happen to me again. And somewhere in there, I built it into a company that does the throwing." He let that sit in the beautiful room. 8 days ago, I walked into my own restaurant in my old boots, and your general manager turned me away at the door, fully committed, 4 empty tables, and the only person in this building who fed a tired stranger for free was a server named Nora Bell, who I'm told is no longer on the schedule, because feeding tired strangers is, according to the spreadsheet, money left on the table. Gideon had gone the color of the linen. "I'm not voting to elevate Sal's legacy into a velvet rope," Daniel said. "I'm voting to put the open door back. The Hartwell Reserve concept is finished. The membership tier is finished. The family meal goes back on the stove tonight and stays there. Every server cut in the last 6 months gets their job back with the back pay, paid out of my own pocket, not the company's, because I'm the one who looked away while it happened. And Gideon," he turned to the man, and his voice did not rise, "you turned a tired man away from a door Sal Moreno kept open for 25 years. You're free to go run a velvet rope somewhere it belongs. It does not belong here." The cost of it was enormous, and the board knew it to the dollar. The reserve projections, the membership revenue, the brand deck, all of it, set on fire in a single, careful speech. And Ms. Asher, the Grey board member with 3 votes, looked at the man in the worn boots for a long moment, and then she said, dryly, "I would like, before I vote, to finally try the white beans." And that, Walt would say later, was the moment the wind changed. Walt brought them himself, from the pot he had quietly kept going on the back burner all through the event he was supposedly not cooking for. And he served the board the staff meal in the chipped white bowls that should have been retired years ago. And the room full of grey and gold, 8 Sal Moreno's beans under the event lighting with the string trio playing. And it got quiet, in the good way. The way Daniel had been chasing for 8 months on a coastline. And Miss Asher set down her spoon and looked at the man in the worn boots and said nothing at all. Which, from a woman who controlled 3 votes, was a paragraph. And then a thing happened that Daniel had not arranged and could not have, because the only speeches a man can truly trust are the ones he doesn't write. Camille stood up. She had been at the host stand in her crisp black with her perfect lipstick. The captain's promotion 2 days from being hers. The one good blazer she mended on a milk crate, buttoned over a spine she held like a fortress. And she stood up in front of the board and the founder and the man who signed her schedule. And she said, in the sorry-about-nothing voice, but used now for the opposite purpose, I turned him away. At the door. 8 days ago. In the rain. 4 empty tables. And I told him we were fully committed. Because that's the phrase we were trained to use. And because he looked like he couldn't pay. And I am very good at my job. And my job, as it has been redesigned, is deciding at the door who gets to be a person in here. I want it on the record before you vote that the only one of us who got it right was the server who isn't on the schedule anymore. She broke the rule on that laminated card the first night. I enforced it for a year and told myself it was standards. She paused, and her chin did not waver. And everyone in that room understood she had just walked her promotion out the open door on purpose. I'd like the open door back too. I'd like to stop being good at the wrong thing. It cost her the captain's job. Gideon's last act with any authority in that room was to make sure of it before he understood he had no authority left. And she paid it standing up. And Daniel looked at her with something close to awe. And Nora, when she finally heard about it days later, would not be surprised, because she had seen a woman mend her one good blazer under a bad bulb, and known that the armor was sewn over the same milk crate as her own, and that a person willing to pay that much to keep her dignity at the seams would, given one chance to keep it out loud, pay even more. The vote was not close in the end. Ms. Asher's 3 votes followed her spoon. The Hartwell Reserve concept collapsed in the most beautiful room in the city, with a bowl of free beans cooling in front of every person who voted it down. And Gideon Pratt walked out under the brass and frosted glass lamp he had called a statement light. And the lamp, Walt observed to no one, had finally gotten the audience it deserved. But Nora was not there to see it. That was the thing. He had won back the room and the door and the vine and the beans. And the one person it had all been for was at home with a coffee mug in front of a seedling she couldn't look at. And a one restaurant is not a one woman. And Daniel Hart, who could buy anything, sat down in the applause he didn't want, and understood that the only thing he actually wanted could not be bought, recovered, or apologized into being, and that he had no idea, for the first time in 15 years, what to do next. Walt told him. Walt found him by the kitchen door after the board had gone, standing over the apron still folded on the chair at table 13, the dropped larkspur leaf still on it. And Walt picked up the apron and felt the small, soft lump in the pocket, and took out the bar napkin, worn nearly to cloth from 9 days of being carried, and read the 3 careful words in Daniel's own hand. Thank you, Nora. And the old dishwasher, who had taught the boy to pull bread 15 years before, looked at the man the boy had become and said, She kept it. He set the napkin in Daniel's hand. All this time, she kept it. And then Walt said the longest and last thing he would say in this story. You want her to believe you didn't buy her? Then don't show up rich. Show up the way she met you. And bring her the only thing in this building that was hers before it was yours. There was a knock at Nora's door on the 9th night. Soft, twice. And when she opened it, there was no billionaire on the landing. There was a tired man in a faded canvas jacket and worn boots. No car at the curb that she could see. No flowers, no envelope. Holding in both hands a frail green thing in a paper pot. Not the seedling from the market, a different one, older, root-bound, half-ruined and stubbornly alive. It was the larkspur. Sal's larkspur. The one from the kitchen door. The one she had watered in secret from a pint glass for years, because someone should. He had dug it up and brought it to her in his arms in the rain, like the only inheritance that mattered. I didn't bring money, Daniel said. I know how that would land. I didn't bring the company. You don't want the company. He held the vine out a little helplessly, this man who had unmade an empire's plan with one speech and did not know how to stand on a landing. I brought the thing I was supposed to take care of, and didn't. It's been failing by that door for 2 years, and you're the only one who watered it. And that's the whole thing, Nora. That's everything I came to say. You water things nobody's watching. You fed a man you thought had nothing. The test wasn't ever you. I wasn't testing you. I came home in these boots to find out if I'd let them ruin the place Sal built. And the answer was yes, I had. Everywhere except the warped end of one bar, where a waitress who didn't know my name was keeping the whole thing alive by herself. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed over the ache in her chest and said the things she had practiced. You let me say what I wanted, in the rain. And you already owned the... I asked you what you wanted before I knew you'd ever find out who I was, Daniel said. You promised you'd remember the underpass. I'm holding you to it. I didn't ask because it was useful. I asked because no one had asked you since you were 9, and you're the bravest person I've ever met, and somebody should have asked you a long time ago. His voice, the careful voice, finally went unsteady, all the way. The brass bottle opener nowhere now, because both his hands were full of failing flowers. I don't want to give you anything. You'd hate that, and you'd be right to. I want to ask you the question again, and mean it the same way. What do you want? Nora? Not what you need. What do you want? And if the answer doesn't have me in it, I'll put this vine in your hands and go, and the door at the larkspur will be open to you and your brother for the rest of your life, with nobody watching the spreadsheet. And that's not a bribe. That's just the door being a door again. The rain came down on the landing. Inside, on the windowsill, the market seedling held up its 2 leaves behind the coffee mug Nora had set in front of it, so she wouldn't have to hope. And Nora Bell, who gave everything away and kept almost nothing, looked at the half-ruined larkspur in the arms of a man who had brought her the one thing in his whole vast world that had been hers first. And she felt the lie she'd lived in since she was 9. You're only worth what you're useful for. Wanting is for other people. Go quiet. Not gone, but quiet. For the first time. Because here was a man who had set fire to an empire's plan, and then shown up in his old boots to ask her, twice in the rain, what she wanted, expecting nothing, prepared to leave. I want a small, green place of my own, she heard herself say. Steady. Out loud, to him. Rows of things I grew from seed, soil under my nails for a reason that's mine. I've wanted it since I was a girl, and I never told anybody, because I was scared that wanting it out loud would... Her voice caught. Would make it a thing I could lose. Then we should keep that one alive first, Daniel said softly, lifting the vine an inch, before it loses any more leaves. I happen to know a glass house with very good light. There's a corner by a kitchen door, a little dip in the floor, terrible for a tray cart, perfect for a person who knows how to make things grow. A breath. I'm not offering you a job. I'd never insult you with a job. I'm asking if you'd want to build the small green place inside the place Sal built, and own it, your name on it, a partner, not an employee, and run a door that's open and let me carry the bags. That part, the carrying the bags, that part I'd do whether or not there's a single flower in it for me. But I'm hoping there's a flower in it for me. I'm hoping that more than I've hoped for anything since I was 18 and cold, and somebody handed me a chipped bowl of beans. And Nora Bell took the half-ruined vine out of his arms, because someone should, because she always did. And then, and this was new, this was the whole arc of her in one motion. She did not immediately turn to busy herself with it. She set it down on the floor of the landing, gently, in the rain, and she reached up and took the worn collar of his canvas jacket in both her hands, the jacket of the backpacker she'd fed for free, not the suit of the man who owned the room. And she pulled him in, out of the doorway, and she said, "Okay, the underpass. I remember the underpass." She didn't say the other thing, the big, declared thing, because the subtext mandate of her own heart had taught her that the words that do the real work are never the loudest ones. She just held the collar of the jacket and let herself be held back, and behind them, the market seedling on the windowsill and the half-ruined larkspur on the rainy landing held up their leaves to the same grey sky, asking for once, for something, and getting it. The larkspur turned 26 the following spring, and the most beautiful room in the city was warm again, and the door was open, and there was a chipped white bowl that should have been retired years ago but never would be, sitting in a place of honor on the host stand where Camille, who had stayed, who had stood up at the board meeting after Daniel's speech and told the truth about who'd been turned away and who'd been kind, and lost her shot at the captain's promotion for it, and found she could sleep again afterward, kept it polished and full of matches. Walt still ran the pit at the speed of continental drift. Eli worked weekends now, on the line, learning the chemistry that was objectively the coolest part, and the not getting yelled at part, which Daniel told him mattered just as much. Gideon had landed, by all accounts, at a members-only club across town with a very good velvet rope, where he was reportedly happy, or at least correct. And in the corner by the kitchen door, where the dip in the floor caught a tray cart's wheel, there were cold frames now, and rows of seedlings in paper pots, and a small green place with a hand-lettered sign that said, "Bell and Moreno Growers," because she'd insisted on Sal's name beside her own, and behind it, climbing the iron rib of the roof where it had always belonged, the larkspur vine. Sal's larkspur, Lark's larkspur, replanted with its roots in good soil, and a woman watching it who was, at last, no longer doing it in secret. It bloomed in early June, a riot of blue-violet spires running up the glass, visible from the street, free to anyone who walked by, tired, and looked up. And Daniel Hart stood under it in his old boots, with soil on his hands, and his wife's hand in his. She had let him carry the bags, and exactly one bag had turned out to have a flower in it. And a tired stranger came in out of the rain through the open door, and the only person who turned to smile at him first was the waitress everybody listened to now, who walked over and said, before anyone could tell him they were fully committed, "We've got a table, the good one, by the flowers. Sit. The house special isn't on the menu."